The small flickering light of the first Hanukkah candle danced, casting long, wavering shadows across the living room wall. It was a familiar ritual, a comfort, but tonight it felt different. The air was thick with something cold, something sharp, even before the words cut through the quiet. Seriously? All this fuss for one tiny flame? The voice belonged to Alex, a distant cousin, but it held the weight of a stranger's judgment. It's just a candle, a childish ritual. What a waste of time and light. Alex's words hung in the air, a dismissive wave of a hand accompanying them. They mocked the simple beauty of the moment, the reverence I held for this tradition passed down through generations. He gestured towards the electric menorah blinking brightly in the window of the house across the street, a stark contrast to our humble, real flame. That's how people celebrate now. Efficient, modern. This is just quaint, almost embarrassing. His tone made it clear he found it more than quaint. He found it utterly ridiculous. It exposed a deep-seated disrespect, a disregard for the very core of my beliefs, my heritage. Instead of the anger I usually felt when Alex made these kinds of remarks, a strange calm settled over me. My hand, which had been holding the match, steadied. A quiet, almost imperceptible smile touched my lips, a private thought forming in my mind. Without a word, I reached out, and, with a deliberate slowness that made Alex's eyes widen slightly, I extinguished the electric candle he had brought earlier for his own celebration on the coffee table. The small, artificial glow vanished, plunging that immediate corner of the room into a deeper, symbolic darkness. Alex's face registered a flicker of shock, then a dawning realization. The air thickened. He had expected a fight, a tearful defense, but not this quiet, firm action. He leaned forward, his mouth slightly open, as if to speak, but no words came out. The only sound was the soft crackle of the single Hanukkah candle's wick. My small act, extinguishing his modern bright light, somehow held more power than any argument I could have made. He saw it then, the subtle shift, the unexpected strength in my quiet defiance. The tension in the room was palpable, a heavy blanket that suddenly felt too tight. Sometimes the smallest flame can ignite the greatest change. I turned away from Alex, leaving him in the sudden, eerie dimness. The single Hanukkah candle now the only source of light. Its flame danced, casting my shadow long and distorted against the wall, almost like a silent, ominous warning. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. My earliest memories are bathed in the soft glow of candles, not just during Hanukkah, but every Shabbat, every holiday. I grew up in a small, tight-knit community, not in some grand, historic city, but in a quiet neighborhood that felt like its own little world, a bubble of tradition and warmth. It was a place where the scent of challah baking mingled with the crisp autumn air, and the sound of children playing hopscotch echoed alongside the melodies of old prayers. Hanukkah wasn't just a holiday. It was the rhythm of our winter, a promise of light in the darkest days. Our community might not have been in Eastern Europe, but it carried the spirit of those places. My grandparents, who had seen true hardship, made sure of that. They brought with them stories, recipes, and traditions that felt as ancient and solid as the earth itself. They taught me about resilience, about holding on to what matters when everything else tries to pull it away. The bustling market on Thursdays, where everyone knew your name and your grandmother's favorite spice, felt like a miniature version of the old world. Family gatherings were loud, chaotic, and brimming with love. Every Friday night, our house was filled with the flicker of Shabbat candles, the aroma of chicken soup, and the comforting drone of Hebrew prayers. It wasn't just religion, it was life, woven into every thread of our days. I was a quiet child, often found in a corner with a book, or listening intently to my grandmother's stories. Other kids ran around, chasing balls, but I preferred the steady presence of tradition. Because of this, I sometimes felt a little overlooked, a little too serious for my age. My teachers would say I was well-behaved, which often felt like code for doesn't cause trouble. I wasn't the loudest or the fastest, or the one with the flashiest toys. My focus was on the past, on understanding the stories, the songs, the reasons behind every blessing and every custom. There was a deep longing in me, even then, for recognition, not for myself, but for the traditions I cherished. My dream, though I couldn't put it into words then, was to preserve this legacy, to make sure these lights, these stories, never faded. Alex came into our lives when he was a teenager. He was a friend of my older cousin, an outsider in our close-knit circle, initially fascinated by our traditions. He'd sit at our Shabbat table wide-eyed, asking questions about the blessings, the food, the meaning of everything. He seemed genuinely curious, almost drawn to the warmth and history he found in our home. My grandmother, always one to welcome a soul, treated him like another grandson. He was charming, quick-witted, and seemed to soak up every story, every melody. We all thought he was a good addition, someone who appreciated what we had. But as time went on, the initial curiosity started to shift. It was subtle at first, just small things. A raised eyebrow when my parents insisted on keeping kosher, a dismissive shrug when we talked about the importance of giving to charity. He'd make comments, disguised as jokes, about how old-fashioned some of our ways were. He'd say things like, "Why do you still do all that? It's the 21st century." And when I tried to explain the deeper meaning, the connection to our ancestors, the resilience embedded in these practices, his eyes would glaze over. The fascination he once had slowly gave way to a dismissive attitude, a quiet judgment of the very traditions that defined me and us. The seeds of conflict were sown, small and almost invisible, but growing steadily beneath the surface of our shared family life. As I grew older, Alex's subtle dismissals became more frequent, chipping away at my trust and self-worth. It wasn't a sudden break, but rather a slow, steady erosion, like water wearing down stone. I remember one specific time during my early college years. I was trying to organize a cultural exchange program between our community and a local university. It was a big undertaking, something I poured my heart into. Alex, who had some connections in the university administration through his father, made grand assurances that he would help secure a venue and some initial funding. He promised to introduce me to key people, telling me he was all in to support my efforts to share our heritage. I believed him. I trusted him. But when the crucial meeting came, he simply didn't show up. He left me hanging, scrambling to explain his absence, making me look disorganized and unreliable. His excuse later was a vague, "something came up," delivered with a shrug that felt like a slap in the face. I had to pick up the pieces, apologize profusely, and rebuild connections from scratch. This wasn't the only time he abandoned me at a critical moment, leaving me to shoulder the burden of his broken promises. Then there were the veiled humiliations. He excelled at making public remarks that sounded like jokes, but always had a sharp edge, especially when they touched on my cultural practices. At a family dinner celebrating Passover, I was explaining the symbolism of the Seder plate to a new guest. Alex from across the table loudly interjected, "Oh, she loves all that ancient stuff. You know, living history. Some of us actually live in the present, though." He laughed, and a few others chuckled nervously. It wasn't overtly mean, but it made me feel like my dedication was something to be mocked, something childish. These incidents often happened at community gatherings, making me feel isolated, even when surrounded by loved ones. His words made me question if my passion for our heritage was misplaced, if I was indeed clinging to something old-fashioned in a modern world. He had a way of twisting things, making me doubt my own perceptions. He was a master of manipulation and gaslighting. I remember vividly discussing a historical fact about our community's migration with him. I had researched it extensively for a project. He first agreed with me, then later, in front of others, completely denied ever having that conversation, even suggesting I had misremembered the facts. He said, "Are you sure you heard that right? That's not what I said at all." It made me question my memory, my research, my sanity. It was particularly jarring when these twisted narratives involved the shared cultural experiences, moments we had both witnessed. He'd deny past statements, making me feel like I was losing my mind, constantly questioning what was real and what wasn't. There were also moments of blatant injustice. I had spent months developing a proposal for a youth mentorship program focused on teaching traditional crafts and stories. It was my idea, my research, my passion project. I shared it with Alex, hoping for his support. A few weeks later, I heard through the grapevine that he was presenting a very similar program to the community elders, taking full credit for the concept. He had simply rebranded my work as his own. When I confronted him, he shrugged, saying, "Great minds think alike, I guess. Besides, you weren't moving fast enough." It felt like a punch to the gut. He actively sabotaged my efforts to connect with my community, presenting himself as the more proactive, more capable leader, while I was left feeling like a shadow. The Hanukkah candle incident wasn't a random event. It was the final straw, the culmination of years of quiet disrespect, broken promises, and subtle undermining. It was a public act of disregard for something deeply sacred to me, a final, undeniable sign that my enduring patience with Alex had finally run out. It was the moment I realized that his mockery wasn't just about my traditions. It was about trying to extinguish my spirit. The emotional atmosphere became increasingly stifling. I felt a constant unease whenever Alex was present, like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon. Every interaction, even the seemingly innocuous ones, carried a hidden weight, a silent threat that could erupt at any moment. It was exhausting, this perpetual state of vigilance. I found myself anticipating his next slight, his next dismissive comment, before he even opened his mouth. Minor disagreements, which in any other relationship would have been resolved quickly, now escalated into heated arguments. We'd argue over trivial matters: the best route to the market, the correct way to store a certain food, the meaning of a vague sentence in an old family letter. But these were never really about the topic at hand. They were always about the fundamental differences in our values, about his inherent lack of respect for my perspective and my growing frustration with his condescension. He'd twist my words, accuse me of being overly sensitive, or simply laugh off my concerns, which only fueled the fire. He seemed to relish the conflict, thriving on the power dynamic it created. Subtly but surely, I began to experience a growing judgment from those around us. Neighbors, distant relatives, even some colleagues at the community center seemed to have absorbed Alex's narrative. Whispers followed me, and knowing glances were exchanged when I spoke. It wasn't overt hostility, but a colder reception, a subtle distancing. People who once sought my advice on cultural matters now seemed to prefer his. I overheard snippets of conversations. "Alex is so practical," or "she's a bit too intense about these old ways, isn't she?" His carefully crafted public persona was working, slowly eroding my standing within the very community I cherished. It felt like being slowly isolated, cut off from the roots that nourished me. Alex's demeanor worsened with each passing week. He became more openly condescending, his remarks sharper, laced with a venom that was difficult to ignore. He stopped even pretending to care about my feelings or beliefs. If I spoke about a tradition, he'd interrupt with a scoff or a sarcastic, "Oh, here we go again with the ancient wisdom." His actions became more overtly dismissive. He would conspicuously check his watch when I was speaking, turn his back mid-sentence, or simply walk away. It was a constant barrage of tiny, yet impactful slights, designed to make me feel small and insignificant. I felt trapped, walking on eggshells in my own life. My attempts to assert myself, to defend my views or my passion, were met with ridicule or outright dismissal. "You're overreacting," he'd say. "It's just a joke." Or, "Why do you always have to make everything so dramatic?" The weight of this emotional burden became almost unbearable. Sleepless nights became the norm, my mind replaying his words, his sneers, his dismissive gestures. I felt a profound sense of isolation, even when surrounded by people. My spirit, once so vibrant and connected to my heritage, felt like it was slowly being crushed under the constant pressure. This period was my lowest point. I started to question everything. Was he right? Was my dedication to our traditions foolish? Was I indeed too old-fashioned for this modern world? The thought of giving up on my dreams, on the very essence of who I was, became a dark, persistent whisper in my mind. I contemplated abandoning the cultural projects I had poured my heart into, feeling utterly defeated and unseen. The light of my spirit flickered, almost ready to be extinguished, just like the candle I had lit that Hanukkah night. I was on the brink of surrendering, losing myself entirely to the shadow he cast. But then, something shifted. It wasn't a sudden burst of courage, but more like a quiet snap, the sound of a cord finally breaking after being stretched too thin for too long. The turning point came, not from a confrontation, but from a devastating revelation that hit me like a physical blow. I had been working tirelessly on a community project, a digital archive to preserve old family stories and traditions, something I believed would connect generations. Funding was always a challenge, and I'd been puzzled by a string of rejections from local grants I usually secured without issue. Each time, Alex would offer empty condolences, a smirk playing on his lips. I dismissed it as bad luck, or maybe my own shortcomings. Then, a casual conversation with an old friend, a former colleague of Alex's, opened my eyes. She mentioned, almost offhandedly, how Alex had been so busy, bad-mouthing my project behind the scenes, telling potential donors it was disorganized, unnecessary, and even a little cultish. He'd actively worked to undermine it, not just by spreading false rumors, but by subtly suggesting I was unstable and unreliable, especially about my cultural endeavors. He hadn't just been dismissive, he had actively sabotaged my efforts, systematically dismantling my credibility within the community for years. The realization hit me hard. It wasn't just about disrespect. It was about deliberate, malicious destruction of my life's work and reputation. It was a cold, calculated betrayal. Armed with this undeniable proof, not just of his disdain, but of his active malice, a quiet resolve settled over me. There was no anger, no shouting, just a profound, chilling clarity. I made a resolute decision right then and there. I would cease all contact with him. It wasn't about revenge. It was about self-preservation. It was about protecting myself, my work, and my heritage from a poison that had seeped into every corner of my life. I couldn't allow someone who sought to destroy me to remain in my orbit. The thought of confronting him, of giving him another platform for his manipulations, felt pointless. The truth was enough. My silence would be my answer. Of course, Alex didn't take my sudden withdrawal well. He interpreted my silence not as strength, but as a challenge. In a desperate attempt to regain control and reassert his dominance, he launched an even more aggressive public campaign against me. He started spreading more outlandish stories, painting me as erratic and ungrateful. He even staged a grand, performative apology at a community event, tearfully declaring his concern for my mental well-being and offering to help me find my way back. It was a masterclass in gaslighting, designed to make me look unstable, and him, the benevolent victim. His words, dripping with false sincerity, were meant to further isolate me. But this time, his public display backfired spectacularly. His over-the-top performance, coupled with my sudden, dignified silence, raised eyebrows. People had seen his behavior, had heard his whispers, and now my quiet withdrawal made his theatrics seem hollow and desperate. And then an unexpected opportunity, or rather an unexpected truth, was exposed. An elderly woman, Mrs. Goldstein, a quiet figure who had always observed more than she spoke, stepped forward. She had been a recipient of one of my cultural grants that Alex had supposedly sabotaged. She had heard his whispers, seen his machinations, and had been patiently gathering evidence. She came forward with a meticulously kept journal detailing Alex's attempts to discredit my project, his fabricated stories, and his subtle pressures on community leaders to withdraw support. Her testimony, calm and irrefutable, exposed the full extent of his manipulation to the entire community. Her words, backed by her impeccable reputation, were like a dam breaking. Suddenly, all the subtle slights, the whispered rumors, the lost opportunities, they all clicked into place. The truth, once hidden, was now out in the open, undeniable. Alex's carefully constructed facade crumbled, not with a bang, but with a collective gasp of realization from the community. This revelation and the subsequent support from those who finally saw the truth finally broke the cycle of suffering. The narrative power, which he had so expertly wielded, shifted back to me. The light, which had flickered so precariously, was now steady, shining brightly on the truth. The immediate aftermath was a strange mix of emotions. There was a huge wave of relief, like a heavy weight had finally lifted from my chest. But with it came a profound sadness for all the years lost, the energy wasted, and the trust that was so carelessly broken. A fear of the unknown also gnawed at me. What would life be like without this constant battle? Could I truly move on? And under it all, a surge of empowering anger simmered. Not a destructive rage, but a quiet, firm anger that fueled a new kind of determination. Moments of self-doubt still crept in. I'd lie awake at night, replaying conversations, wondering if I had been too harsh, if I had pushed too hard. Had I done the right thing by exposing him so publicly? A lingering sense of shame, a residue from years of his manipulation, would surface. He had been so good at making me feel small, making me question my own sanity. It wasn't something you just shook off overnight. One evening, alone in my apartment, the quiet became too much. The silence, usually a comfort, felt heavy with unspoken pain. I found myself sitting on the floor, tears finally coming in a torrent. It wasn't a sob of defeat, but a release. A guttural cry that emptied out years of stored-up hurt. When it finally subsided, I felt lighter, clearer. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the city lights. I whispered to myself, a firm, clear declaration. I will rebuild. I will not let this define me. It was a private moment of catharsis, a quiet explosion that marked a true turning point. The community's reaction was varied, reflecting the complex dynamics of our close-knit world. My long-standing friends, who had perhaps seen glimpses of Alex's true nature but felt powerless to intervene, now rallied around me. Sarah, who had always been a quiet supporter of my projects, showed up with a casserole and a listening ear, validating every emotion I expressed. My cousin David, who was usually reserved, became my fiercest defender in social circles, subtly correcting misinformation and speaking up for my character. Their unwavering support was a lifeline, helping me navigate the whispers and curious glances that still lingered. They weren't just friends, they were allies, helping me piece together my fractured sense of self. But not everyone was supportive. Some individuals who had either benefited from Alex's influence or simply shared his dismissive views about tradition began to distance themselves. A few even openly criticized me, calling me vindictive or unforgiving. Mr. Cohen, a man who had always seemed friendly, suddenly avoided eye contact, his wife even spreading rumors that I was too sensitive. These people, whose true colors now shone through, only solidified my resolve. Their disapproval, once a source of anxiety, now felt like validation. It showed me who was truly in my corner and who was simply a fair-weather friend. The cultural dynamics played a huge part in how everything unfolded. Our community, deeply rooted in tradition, had a strong sense of collective responsibility. Some elders, wise and measured, emphasized reconciliation and healing, urging caution and understanding. They spoke of forgiveness, not as forgetting, but as a path to peace. Younger members, however, often championed justice and accountability, pushing for transparency and change. This led to nuanced social dynamics, with spirited debates and differing opinions on how to move forward. The synagogue became a hub of discussion, with sermons often addressing themes of truth, community, and resilience. The profound psychological impact of everything I'd been through was something I grappled with daily. Learning to trust my own judgment again, after years of being gaslighted, was a slow process. I had to consciously remind myself that my perceptions were valid, that my feelings were real. Rebuilding my sense of identity, now free from Alex's shadow, felt like emerging from a long, dark tunnel. The experience reshaped my understanding of trust, not just in others, but in myself. It taught me the true meaning of community, not just as a place, but as a network of support that could either uplift or diminish. I was scarred, yes, but also stronger, with a clearer vision of who I was and what I stood for. With the dust settling, I actively started to rebuild my life and, more importantly, my connection to the community. It wasn't about forgetting the past, but about using it as a foundation for something stronger. I rediscovered the joy in our traditions, not just as duties, but as living expressions of our history and spirit. I began leading new cultural initiatives at the synagogue, starting with a series of workshops on forgotten Jewish crafts. The first one, focusing on intricate paper-cutting art for Hanukkah decorations, was a huge success, bringing together people of all ages. I also started a mentorship program for younger members, sharing stories of resilience and the importance of preserving our heritage, especially in the face of adversity. It felt good, purposeful, like I was finally channeling all that pain into something beautiful and lasting. Alex, on the other hand, faced his own consequences. The community, once swayed by his charm, now saw him for what he was. He wasn't formally banished, but the informal ostracization was palpable. Invitations to social gatherings stopped coming, his opinions were no longer sought, and his once thriving business saw a noticeable downturn as people quietly took their patronage elsewhere. His social standing, built on a foundation of manipulation and deceit, crumbled. There were no legal repercussions, as his actions, while morally reprehensible, didn't cross that line. But the loss of respect, the quiet shunning, was a fitting and realistic punishment within our close-knit cultural context. He became a ghost in his own life, present but unseen, unheard. I achieved a deep sense of peace and vindication, not from seeing Alex suffer, but from my own personal growth and the restoration of my reputation. It wasn't revenge I sought, but justice and truth, and I found it in the unwavering support of my community and my own renewed strength. The community too began to heal. The truth had been acknowledged, the unspoken tensions released, and a new understanding of integrity and communal responsibility emerged. We learned to be more discerning, more protective of our shared values, and more vocal in defending those who were wronged. Reflecting on the entire journey, the lessons learned were profound and etched into my very being. I understood the paramount importance of self-worth, of trusting my own voice even when others tried to silence it. The strength of our cultural heritage, once something I felt I had to protect from outside forces, now revealed itself as an internal, unbreakable core. It was a wellspring of resilience, a constant reminder of who I was and where I came from. And perhaps most significantly, I learned the incredible power of standing up for oneself, not with aggression, but with quiet conviction and unwavering truth. This whole experience, from the first flicker of that Hanukkah candle to the final rebuilding, brought me back to the core message of the holiday itself. Hanukkah is not just about a military victory or a miracle of oil. It's about the triumph of light over darkness, the perseverance of faith in the face of overwhelming odds, and the enduring power of tradition to guide us through our darkest moments. The single candle, lit one at a time, day after day, year after year, symbolizes not just the miracle of the oil, but the gradual, persistent effort required to reclaim one's light, to push back against the shadows, and to illuminate the path forward, one small, brave flame at a time. My journey was a testament to that, a living, breathing Hanukkah story,